appreciate everyone taking a minute to join us. So Brad Parks with Morpheus Data, joined by William Fellows from 451 Research. We're excited to have you on the webinar today. We're going to unpack a bit of data that 451 Research has put together. They've been doing the Voice of the Enterprise survey for a number of years, and I always find a lot of value in unpacking what they're hearing from enterprise customers out there, as well as service providers, because this intersection of hybrid cloud and DevOps touches a lot of parts of the organization. So real quick, Brad Parks. So I manage the marketing function and go-to-market here for Morpheus Data. As mentioned, joined by William Fellows. William, I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm sure you can do a lot better job of it than I could.
No, thanks. That was great, Brett. I was one of the co-founders of 451 Research, and I look after the cloud research here with a particular focus now on cloud native. But the evolution of cloud management platforms is very much part of my brief here, and indeed taking the data that Brad referred to from this global alliance of enterprise practitioners that we survey on a regular basis, for their spending intent across different technologies and geographies and applications and so on, that surfaced in our Voice of the Enterprise. And if you want to circle back with me after this, I'll be happy to introduce you to the research and set you up with access and all that good stuff. So let's crack on.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, William. And we do have one thing we'll send out after this. We actually have a copy or an excerpt of a lot of the data that William's going to share. So we'll be sure to send that off to all the attendees as well. So I think jumping in, so we're going to take about a half hour, 40 minutes, I think, to go through this. Invite Q&A. If you can use the question option, at the bottom. We've all done 1,000 webinars at this point over the last couple of years. I'm sure people know where to find that. We'll be sure to keep an eye on that over the course of the session. But please, feel free to ask some questions, and we'll address those as we go, or we'll clean them up at the end. But to start out, we do sit at this intersection of multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. Pick your term. The point is, things are very messy out there, and so I guess to start off, William, if you could maybe give a little commentary on kind of the state of affairs as it relates to hybrid, and what's kind of driving the hybrid nature of our new reality.
Sure thing. Well, it's interesting that you use the the term cloud control planes there, because I think very much what we're seeing at the moment is the evolution from traditional cloud management platforms focused on those primitives. Now they're having to address the sort of converging challenges of increased complexity, as well as things like skill shortages and the replatforming to cloud native, and the kind of the normal, the reality of multi-cloud, and really to deliver applications and workloads kind of here, there, and everywhere, and taken together with the fact that we're sort of entering, I guess, this era when cloud is no longer going to be seen as a separate IT category. Quite simply, it is the IT, and so traditional CMPs are going to be, well, either superseded or supplemented really by these control planes that can act on an entire IT estate and address a richer, a wider set of personas. But if you want to move the slides on, Brett, and I can talk to some of those things specifically. And here we're just going to take a look at the what we call the cloud complexity storm, and what the drivers of this are. And I mean, I think the context is that hybrid IT has won the architectural war, and the reality of today is that it's both a design point and a strategic initiative. And this is going to, the sort of hybrid IT estates with on-prem infrastructure is going to be around with us for years, and multi-cloud's now the organizing principle. But all of these transformations leave behind really a huge amount of debt. In addition, as workloads are modernized and sort of untethered now, I suppose, from specific execution venues to run, whether private, public, centralized, edge, etc. It creates a lot of complexity and operational challenges that undermine the efforts to, to be able to execute on these digital strategies. And then there are the compliance and data management challenges and so on. And I mean, I think the thing is that this sort of points to this sort of storm of complexity, and that's compounded by the vast number of services and components that are spread across the public clouds now. So about 3/4 of organizations currently using sort of multiple cloud platforms, and in 451's researchers, well, our cloud price index, we tracking more than 3 million products which are now, or SKUs I should say to be more specific, that actually can be purchased from the major hyperscalers alone. Now, how anyone is supposed to deal with that range of complexity and choose the right things. And specifically then, when we asked our global alliance how they characterize the complexity of their organization's cloud IT environments, nearly 3/4 said it's high or moderate complexity. And when we asked, which factors have contributed to the complexity of their environment, then it's technical debt, the application modernization challenges that they face, the compliance for regulated workloads, and data silos come out top. But I wonder, Brad, what are you seeing amongst your customer base specifically? Does this chime with what's going on where you see it?
Yeah, a couple things jumped out when I first read the research a handful of weeks ago when you guys put it out. The first off, I think amongst the customers we talk to, hybrid cloud is as much a strategy as it is an inevitability, right? We sell to a lot of large enterprises as well as service providers, and I think given any amount of time, you're going to have M&A, different teams spinning up workloads in different environments. As you mentioned, hybrid IT or multi-cloud is just a reality, whether you plan for it or not. On the drivers, it's interesting. The thing that jumped out at me is this is almost a top-down view of a maturity curve, right? I think early to the mid, part of a cloud journey, that technical debt is always top of mind. And I think even companies who've been using cloud in anger for nearly a decade, a majority of their workloads are still in that legacy factor, right? They're running VMs on-prem, they've got a whole bunch of other operational concerns to deal with. So we do see that that legacy technical debt still being one of the biggest. On the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom, cloud platform services are very much coming more and more. I think we've seen this crawl up the chart as companies have kind of moved further and are starting to modernize more and more of their app portfolio. So that was an interesting just observation here. The other piece I think is interesting that we've seen is cost control. That that one on the bottom, second from the bottom. 5-6 years ago, that was very much a very dedicated standalone part of the market, and there still are a lot of great tools that only do cloud cost optimization. But what we've seen over the last 3 years is that become much more a part of a full stack conversation. So that's been another interesting evolution in this space. I think last piece I think is, in addition to the technical complexity, is just the sheer skills gap, right? As a vendor, we face it ourselves trying to hire folks who have these skills, and I can only imagine enterprises. And I think that was the next set of data that you had here.
Yeah, so all of those things that you said, they're only made worse in terms of the overall situation by these skills shortages, and that, I guess, that also scales with organizational complexity. So enterprises with multiple business units, each with multiple workloads and application products, are going to face a cloud management crisis without some level of organizational discipline. And skills and skills shortages, of course, are an issue in the tech sector at the moment. And new and modernized applications, they're being developed on cloud native platforms predominantly now, and that requires new kinds of application development, delivery, expertise, and so on. We already know that well, access to talent is become more of a constraint than access to capital, and employers at the moment are facing, you know, more hiring and retention challenges in the wake of the, let's call it the great resignation or the great renegotiation. That's for sure. So when we asked our panel specifically which skills are most acutely lacking from their cloud environment, you can see here that most said, 41% said cloud platform expertise, followed by cloud native engineering, security, and then DevOps. And, you know, really, I think that speaks to a tremendous opportunity for the industry to fill these gaps and meet these needs. And Brad, you know, Morpheus is a company which was kind of born, you know, in DevOps and so on. And maybe you could sort of talk a bit about how you see, you know, DevOps, you know, impacting the picture here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a child going into university, and I think if I told her to go get a Terraform cert, some Kubernetes experience, and an AWS cert, she could probably name her price exiting school, because it's very much a skill set in demand. I think the piece that we see, and it really is where our genesis came from. You mentioned that we did come out of kind of developer orientation. For those who are maybe new to Morpheus, our platform started actually inside a large portfolio of private equity companies. Our founders were a development team who had to go into different companies and help them modernize their app stacks very, very quickly. So they needed to have expertise in multiple cloud platforms. They were doing cloud native engineering and containers 6 years ago, 7 years ago, before it was really a day-to-day thing in most enterprises. And they were bridging that DevOps gap because they were a very small team. So they built our platform as a result of kind of these skill shortages and the need to move very quickly. But they did it 5-6 years ago. What we're seeing is now, modern enterprises are starting to hit that same critical threshold at scale. I think the interesting piece, and I'll touch on it in a minute, we've seen enterprises kind of evolve from kind of knowing they had a problem 3 or 4 years ago to now actively trying to staff up and tool up platform engineering teams. And I think platform engineering and that competency really sits at the heart of these skill shortages. How do you centralize service delivery for developers? How do you provide a common platform, a common set of APIs, so that individual teams are not having to manage how to provision workloads, how to go spin them up, what cloud portal do I go in? So I think the consolidation of platform engineering is almost a manifestation of trying to get around some of these skill shortages, because you have to do it in one place, otherwise the magnitude of the problem is just untenable.
For sure.
And I know DevOps, you mentioned that. I think that was I think one of the other pieces of data we were going to share is
exactly
double clicking. What is the value people are trying to get? Because we could talk about problems all day long, but it's probably worth flipping it around and seeing what's on the other side, the light at the end of the tunnel.
So really, I think I guess both of these factors, the complexity we talked about at the outset and the skills shortages, stand in the way of these sort of desired DevOps and CI/CD outcomes that organizations are trying to achieve. I mean, interestingly, while the DevOps industry movement, which kind of blends software development and IT operations, is always centered largely on faster software releases and more efficient IT management, the survey data you can see there in front of you shows that enterprises, I think, are increasingly leveraging DevOps to improve, well, really the overall customer experience and satisfaction. And I think that speaks to the sort of maturation of this, and the fact that these things are now coming together to support these broader goals. And specifically, according to the data from the survey, improving the quality of experience for the use of apps and services, the leading outcomes sought by organizations implementing DevOps at 53%. So actually ahead of organizational agility, flexibility, and improving and speeding, the time to market. So doing things faster may be giving way somewhat to a greater need than to focus on the overall experience. And I think, again, Brad, that's something that sort of has been at the DNA of Morpheus from the get-go in where you came from, right?
Yeah, I mean, automation orchestration is kind of a core component of a cloud management conversation. And by putting repeatable automated processes in place and then exposing those, with a self-service mindset, helps you achieve both the quality, right? If you can automate it, make it repeatable, you're going to inherently reduce a lot of the risk and improve quality, but it's also going to help you move a lot faster. So I think the two sides of the coin are very much shown in the data here. And I think it's interesting, as we pivot and start looking at kind of what is, a cloud management platform, what were they, 5-6 years ago, and where do we see this evolving? I think this intersection of cloud and DevOps is going to continue to come closer and closer together, because they're just really different ways of looking at some of the same behaviors and processes, as well as the same tools and technologies.
And Brad, in your experience, and just on that, so what is the sort of extent of the use of things like DevOps centers of excellence, for example, now inside organizations, in order to sort of affect the change management required to do that kind of thing?
Yeah, I've kind of a love-hate relationship with DevOps as a term, right? It's been around for a long time. Sometimes it gets very much misused, right? It's not a person. It's not even a team per se. It really is a cultural change. I think oftentimes when I'm talking with VPs of INO or CIOs, they're using terms and phrases that that harken to a DevOps mindset, but they don't self-identify as a DevOps centric organization. So I try and look at what are they really saying versus what are the words that they're using. And so concepts like self-service, like back to kind of platform engineering, is almost a slightly more modern variation of what people are talking about when they're trying to bring a repeatable process in place that really lets IT and operations kind of manage their critical functions, while still letting developers and internal product teams move much faster. So whether you use the phrase DevOps to describe that, or you talk about platform engineering or application modernization, they're all different ways of kind of having the same types of conversations. And I think that's where cloud management, personally, where I see it going, maybe interesting to take a pause and look at what the data is showing as far as kind of current use, and then we can pivot and look at where we think this market's going here over the next 12, 18 months. Uh-oh. And either William is deep in thought or my screen is frozen. Jen, as our moderator, are you able to tell me if it's me or them? Uh-oh.
Hi.
Looks like
Can you hear
William.
me?
All right. Looks like William just dropped off. So if you can manage that in the background,
I can do that.
I will keep the train going. So the data does speak for itself, and speaking a little bit for William, just so we don't lose time. Cloud management as a category of product has been something that's been around for, I think some of the early CMPs classically started around, I'd say 2011, 2012. And if we think about what the problems were at the time, right, you had developers very aggressively going into public cloud, largely because they wanted to stop waiting for IT to do what developers thought of as their job, right? Provisioning new app stacks, enabling them to access resources very quickly. If IT is taking too long, you end up you end up with developers kind of moving out of band. So the original CMP Design Center was largely around IT organizations trying to start to put guardrails and corral these internal teams. And one of the things that drove a lot of that early discussion was cost, right? Sticker shock from all of a sudden seeing, everybody's, Amex bills pile in or credit card bills pile in because they were just going straight to the public cloud. So those first generation CMPs, started to get deployed. We've seen them start to evolve, and that's what the data shows. About 38% currently in use, but more and more in plan as people are moving into more hybrid environments. Hey, William, welcome back.
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah, my VPN provider decided to close down or something, so I moved somewhere else. So thanks for picking up on that, on the data there. It's interesting. This is a survey that I've been running for, I think, 11 years now, and when it first ran, the number of folks that were actually using cloud management platforms was, the same as where we are with considering but no plan today. In other words, it was about 10%. So it's taken about a decade to for these things to, become mature enough that they've been adopted widely enough. And now with the advent of multi-cloud and so on, and the automation required to be able to deal with the breadth and depth of cloud goods and services, really this is the time they're coming into the fore. And from our side, looking at the market in general, the cloud providers, system vendors, ISVs alike, they're all trying to solve the complexity in the hope of winning the ultimate prize, obviously, which is hosting the management plane that enables the visibility and control of applications across these environments. But I think as more complexity requires an expansion of the sort of conventional CMP to something that is more like akin to a control plane, right across the estate. I mean, at the outset of the market, like I said, a decade or so ago, the cloud management platforms also didn't really target anyone but IT operations. And I guess that was the reason that many first generations products were excuse me, they were either acquired or they've been superseded or taken another direction. And today's management and automation platforms got to traverse this sort of range of personas now, from not only the IT and cloud operations, but developers and security and business and finance and governance and so on, to deal with the complexity and unify what are often disconnected teams, tools, and technologies inside these large enterprises. So it's the CMPs are expanding beyond the management of cloud primitives and just the sort of forensic billing, and evolving into these more expansive, mostly Kubernetes based control planes now. And the control plane becomes, if you like, more an enabler of transformation and optimization and so on. In other words, it goes, well beyond just sort of trying to control or manage the chaos. And I think, Brad, you must have spoken to the actual numbers there during my break there. Sorry.
I did, and you didn't make a liar of me. Actually, it was totally unscripted. Yeah, I mentioned that kind of about a decade ago, right? The design center of early CMPs was a little bit different than the challenge set we're seeing now, and it's a pattern we've seen in technology domains forever, right?
Right.
Every 10 years or so, you get to a maturity level, but at the same time, the problem domain has fundamentally shifted. So you go through a kind of a next generation or an evolution of the space. Sure. And that is something that certainly we've seen. And, looking at really what is the problem that we're seeing today, when we're off talking both to enterprises as well as service providers and what they're saying, it is this mashup of concerns, right? You still have the bottom left, the classic CMP design center is still there, right? How do you set up role-based access around who can provision into what execution venue? How do you set guardrails around cost? That hasn't gone away, but as that has become a relatively understood domain, you've got these new areas that have emerged. And then one of the big ones you touched on briefly today, we're seeing these same centralized IT teams being asked to now take on the operational rigor around Kubernetes and containers. So how do you enable consolidation of management of Kubernetes clusters in the same way you're thinking about hybrid cloud, right? You've got container sprawl and cluster sprawl starting to happen, and it's hitting the same back-end IT team often. Moving around the horn here, infrastructure automation is another one that has just skyrocketed as far as interest, over the last couple of years. So you've got automation teams who have become experts, back to the skills gap, a small set of folks who really do understand, your Ansible playbooks, how you're using Terraform, but that is such a limited skill set. How do you scale that? How do you enable others in the organization to benefit from automation without having to go become an expert in those technologies? And then lastly, something that's been around for over a decade is classic ITSM and Itil processes. It's still out there. You need to be able to still update things like your CMDB and your ServiceNow or your other ITSM tool, but what we're seeing is the role of those classic ITSM functions are changing, right? It's less front end, and now it's a lot more back end. So people want to be able to spin up application stacks, via code as part of their pipelines, develop very quickly, but still have their CI records updated, their CMDBs, still have things like incident management handled, but the role of ITSM is changing. So these are four kind of, I won't say meta trends, but four big categories of concern that are hitting central IT in a different way today than they were, just a few years ago. Does that echo some of what you're seeing? I think it kind of replays some of the data we've already talked about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the integration, I think, with the ITSM stuff is pretty crucial, and obviously ServiceNow is becoming quite a center of gravity for that. So I know there's some interesting work being done around that, and I would say also that there's a range of different disciplines now converging here, which is creating some really interesting new innovations from folks being able to offer new kinds of management that weren't available before, at least in a in a single place. So yeah, very much seeing this.
And I saw, just keeping an eye on the questions, I saw Datley asked if CMP is a trend in the future, and I think what my perspective, I mean, I'll ask with the weigh in back in the data, I think it's definitely going to continue. I think it's going to continue with kind of a new design center, right? I think we're seeing even those 38% who've already adopted are now kind of taking a new look at what they may have deployed five or 6 years ago and saying, how do I approach these new areas still from a centralized control plane? Is that fair to say?
I would say necessary, but now not sufficient if what you're trying to do is to act and operate across your IT estate. So it's a necessary component and function, and unless you're only doing that particular thing, you're going to need a whole bunch of other stuff now, for sure. And thinking about it as more of a a broader control plane, I guess, is the way to sort of distinguish from the sort of the more basic or traditional CMP capabilities.
No, I totally agree. And we, category definition is always something that I think analyst communities and as vendors we struggle with. I think the kind of this unified control plane is something that we're going to see more of, not less. And that's absolutely where where Morpheus fits. And for folks who are newer to Morpheus, just a quick kind of quick overview of how we approach those domains. We start with this concept of self-service, right? The goal of IT, largely should be to be invisible, right? They're sadly often out of sight and out of mind. But if IT is doing its job well, right, developers are getting resources when they need them without waiting. Finance is happy because costs are in line. Security is happy because there are no data leakages or compliance issues. And self-service is at its heart. So when we think about self-service across those 4 domains we just talked about, first, classic CMP across hybrid clouds, we want to enable, whether it's an operational user or a developer user, to provision very quickly the workloads that they need to do their job into any cloud without having to go become a PhD in Amazon or Google or Azure, without having to have the keys to their vCenter or their Nutanix cluster. How do you expose services without having to have a developer get direct access into all those underpinning platforms? And so for Morpheus, we let customers catalog and kind of canonize, these are the application services, these are the OSs, or these are the multi-tier stacks that development teams and internal product teams can provision, and we give them an interface to do that very, very quickly, whether that's via a GUI, whether that's via API CLI or via infrastructure as code. We want them to be able to provision services into clouds without having to wait for IT. Second, kind of that emerging domain, clusters. I think we've moved beyond thinking that there's just going to be some big monolithic, Kubernetes cluster. We're seeing lots of small clusters, in big enterprises. So we want project teams to be able to spin up those clusters on demand while still letting IT kind of manage those, again, without necessarily having to be as deep into Kubernetes command line as as someone who's doing it day in and day out. So how do we make Kubernetes as simple to consume as vSphere is today for VMware admins? That's a big piece for us. We have our own Kubernetes distribution, but we're not trying to go win that war. I don't know that anyone is at this point. We want Kubernetes to just become yet another endpoint that businesses are consuming. So whether you're provisioning cloud native or cloud managed Kubernetes clusters, or using Morpheus to actually templatize and spin up your OpenShift clusters, your Rancher clusters. These are all capabilities that we provide via self-service. Got a third in line. We talked about those precious, automation resources. We want to take the IP, the knowledge out of your highly paid, automation engineer, and make that a repeatable process that you can put into a catalog, that you can let a junior operator say, execute, without having to have that be trapped in the local desktop or inside the head of your automation engineer. So how do you provide catalog access to day 2 automation? How do you mix and match technologies like Ansible, Chef, Salt, Puppet? Every IT shop has hundreds, if not thousands, of automation scripts littered around. We want to bring that into the fold and make it a repeatable process. And then lastly, to that point around ServiceNow and other ITSM stacks, we want to make sure no matter how you're provisioning workloads, that we're handling the care and feeding on the back end of those CMDBs and those CI updates. So that's how Morpheus approaches self-service and bringing those 4 domains together. I think the other piece, and then we'll get back to some of the data, if self-service is at the core, we often see 4 kind of different stakeholders emerge, and I'll ask William to maybe weigh in on what they're seeing across the different data points. But first and foremost, I think the job of unifying those concerns still lands with IT operations. A lot of folks on this call, I think, represent largely that function. You have the charter to go create these centralized platforms, but along the way, you're needing to make sure that the security function needs are met. And so from a Morpheus perspective, we provide the ability to tie into your different identity providers, set up different groups and roles, apply policy to those groups and roles, and make sure that you're handling things like golden image pipelines and shutting down vulnerabilities. So the security function can make sure, yep, you've checked all the boxes before you go let a bunch of developers spin up resources on demand. But speaking of developers, right, you have to make sure developers are getting what they need, or else they're going to just continue to move around IT. I think that's one of the challenges. A lot of kind of IT centric control planes have fallen into a trap where IT feels like they've got their needs met, but when development teams start to use those platforms, they realize they may not have all of the the APIs, the ability to deploy code, some of those other functions met. So for Morpheus, we want to make sure that developers are able to address their needs without feeling like they're handcuffed. So we have a lot of capabilities there. We'd be happy to unpack in a future technical call. And then lastly, one of the things we talked on in the data first slide was cost. Cost management continues to be part of every hybrid cloud conversation. So, from a Morpheus perspective, when we install and attach to your on-prem hypervisors, when we attach to your public cloud accounts, we inventory all of the workloads that are already out there. We can consolidate things like public cloud costing data, set guardrails around cost management, and even provide recommendations on how organizations can optimize their cloud spend. So it really has become a full stack conversation around cloud management. And this is just kind of a quick tasting menu on the features and functions that Morpheus provides around that stack. But I'll maybe turn it back on you, William. I've done too much talking here. How do you see these different personas approaching the hybrid multi-cloud conversation?
So organizations are, now that we're converging on, supporting each of these, there has to be, the organizational will and change management there in order to bring some of these things together. Because, for a large part, these are different buying centers, they're different operating centers. And I think to some degree, the success here is going to be based upon, as I said, the organizational disposition to want this to happen. And this is really the area where, to be frank, vendors have less opportunity to influence when it's to do with the, changing the changing culture of organizations. Nevertheless, if they have a platform which provides the opportunity to take away some of the constraints and especially the technical and functional things, then that's going to ease at least parts of that process and can help enfranchise those different groups that need to operate there. I mean, I think the more sort of self-driving and self-service capabilities are delivered across these as well, the more we really need to have sort of health and safety measures are going to be needed, in control planes which operate across these. And I think the danger is with all of these different things coming together that they get out of control or whatever. And I think a safety first approach is going to be really important here. And on the on the developer and on the finance side, I mean, the whole kind of shift left towards enabling provisioning via policy and code, the IT platform teams are going to need to give developers much more freedom to create and test and develop and iterate services. And indeed, I think that with Kubernetes adoption growing to the point now when enterprises need to change how they account for IT spending, there's going to be some interesting developments around, the economic lens on, these new things versus only on VMs and so on.
Oh, great feedback. Yeah, I think we've seen the advent of just adding ops onto, pick your precursor, right? Yep. IT ops, SecOps, DevOps, FinOps, platform ops. But I think it really is a matter of, like you said, shifting closer together and then working more effectively. I think one of the things you mentioned, I agree wholeheartedly, right? As a technology vendor, we bump into people and process, right, as one of the gating factors often, and it's not an area we can control, but it is one of the reasons we partner with a lot of the largest global systems integrators, managed service providers in the world, because they can bring a lot of that expertise to bear to help enterprise customers deal with some of those people and process issues. And it's probably a good segue into the next set of data, specifically starting with kind of the underpinning infrastructure. What are some of the trends that you're seeing there? But then also, I think we're going to share a little bit of data on MSPs and how service providers are helping to simplify this equation.
So yeah, this is a bit of a busy slide, but and it's a bit of a change of tack. But as Brad said, it's really then looking at the base infrastructure and this is looking at the use of hyper-converged infrastructure within hybrid IT. And what the data is showing here is that organizations are, pretty comfortable now with the ability of HCI to support hybrid IT. And indeed, I think 52% of organizations here say using HCI say they've got a hybrid IT architecture in place, and another 30% are implementing it. And I think also it's worth noting that for some it's even exceeding expectations. Most of them, agree that it eases the process of deploying hybrid IT in their organizations. The underlying trend here, though, really is that using HCI, I think, and composable architectures at the infrastructure layer really sets up the base platform to be more cloud-like, natively. And in the market, of course, clouds are coming in. AWS and Google and Microsoft are extending their cloud systems and software stacks outside of their own data centers with, Outposts and Anthos and Stack and so on. But at the same time, the incumbent infrastructure vendors are extending out. So HP and Dell and Nutanix and Lenovo and Hitachi, they're redesigning and redefining traditional on-prem hardware to better support this hybrid model with consumption-based flexible infrastructure offerings that take advantage of HCI to better compete and so on. So it's everything's moving in a sort of a cloudy direction, and of course, as the market converged on hybrid and multi-cloud, because they offer the best of both worlds, the flexibility of and scalability of seemingly sort of infinite capacity on cloud, plus the predictability and familiarity of operations done on their own tin. And as a result, hardware makers are making their offerings more OpEx based and consumption build, so that they can remain relevant, I suppose, in this increasingly hybrid and flexible landscape. And it's really software and services that are the focus of the strategic pivot. In other words, the base architecture allows them to do a whole bunch of new and great things on top of that. I think private clouds going to look increasingly, cloud-like, and we see a steady demand for private cloud still as a component of hybrid strategies. And indeed, more than half enterprises still consider private cloud as the best execution for workloads, especially those with security and compliance as key requirements. I think this is reflected in the interest here in OpEx-based IT infrastructure consumption, with 60% of those we surveyed either interested or already using hardware-based pay-per-use subscription solutions. And it's an encouraging sign for vendors, considering these structures they're relatively new to the market, especially compared to hyperscale offerings.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons when I saw the background data, I asked William to touch on this. It's been interesting as we're out talking to enterprises and service providers, the level of engagement that we have with companies like HPE between SimpliVity or their DHCI offering, whether it's Dell with VxRail, even Nutanix. I was on a call this morning with Nutanix team, right? I think the infrastructure kind of cloudy nature of the underpinning infrastructure is starting to hit control planes like Morpheus as one of the requirements. So it's been an interesting trend to see those classic infrastructure vendors kind of solve for simplicity, and cloud enablement at the infrastructure level. And that really sets up the next conversation, which is where Morpheus comes in and making those much easier to consume and provision workloads into. So I just thought that was interesting to share. The other
Sure.
piece that we play in a lot is service providers, right? About 35% of the Morpheus customer base are actually service providers who are helping to help with the care and feeding and the hosting a lot of these workloads. So I think the next set of data that William had here in the next closing minutes of the webinar was around service providers, and specifically how are they addressing this, and how can they help some of the enterprises out there.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, obviously this all presents opportunities for MSPs to again fill the gaps that we've identified through the talk here. And what the data told us was that nearly 3/4 of service providers say they are currently offering services to support the design or execution of customer hybrid cloud strategies and environments. Is a common response across all provider types, and of these, more than half offer management of hybrid cloud operations, and only 37% say their offerings include operating individual infrastructure components of a hybrid environment. It kind of suggests that having an infrastructure offering is not a prerequisite for hybrid cloud services. Expertise and tooling really are the key components here. But it also points to the fact that being able to deliver a breadth of these components is a differentiator for some of them. And I think managed services coupled with professional services can really address the skill shortages here. Modern service providers, they have a variety of services packages that they can fit to the sort of customer needs across the spectrum of DIY options to fully manage. They don't have to be a full replacement of the IT. Enterprises can use them to complement existing skills, to upskill. And in addition, professional services and training, staff training or upskilling can help, organizations strengthen their internal capabilities, around DevOps and cloud cost optimization, and give adequate time and incentives to staff to participate in these things. So we expect organizations really to lean more on service providers and managed services to fill skills gaps and bring additional expertise to bear in the modernization and management of their IT environments.
I think one of the other interesting things, and I was just keeping a glance on the chat and the Q&A, outside of the kind of the skills gaps and the managed services that you touched on, is actually the physicality of where these workloads live. And I think one of the questions was, how to, what's the normalized balance between, an on-prem kind of private cloud gated wall versus a public cloud implementation. And the other area we're seeing kind of MSP/CSPs come to play is to be that third execution venue, right? Hosted, managed private clouds, or a more secure or industry specific public cloud. And so I think it was to Jean-Louis asked the question around execution venue. That's one of the areas we see MSPs coming to bear. Also, we think about the more distributed nature of cloud, our edge services, right? As people have, whether it's manufacturing sites or streaming sites that are closer to an edge location outside of a classic data center, but also outside of a hyperscale data center. There are a lot of service providers who are able to provide some very unique, low latency operating paradigms, very close to where applications are being provisioned and where data is being gathered. So we see this service provider landscape opening up quite a bit, as some of these new applications emerge, and that really fits to kind of where Morpheus plays. Any other data that you'd share here, or I'll kind of bring us home.
So, well, I need to answer the question about execution venues. That now we've kind of reached a tipping point where more than 50% of critical application workloads are now executed in public cloud, but actually there's a rising tide of all kinds of hosted services are, coming into view as the platforms of choice for enterprises.
So hosted services, meaning some of the cloud native PaaS services.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think they definitely moved well beyond basic EC2, VM-based services, but people taking advantage of a lot of the hosted applications, and even mixing and matching those. I think that's always the challenge. How do you go depth of service in the public cloud versus more portability and agnosticisms? And that's probably more kind of workload or app dependent than anything. And again, is where a cross-cloud control plane can be advantageous if you're trying to strike that balance. Perfect. Well, I think kind of move in the Morpheus point of view on some of the data points that William just mentioned. So we obviously are our global company. We do have partnerships, not just the ones on the slide here, but with a number of those infrastructure vendors. So we work closely with the HPEs, the Dells, Nutanix, Lenovo, Cisco, even on the global systems integrator front. We have a number of relationships out there. And then even on the NSP side, I mentioned 35% of our business really is helping support those service providers who are in turn, helping customers like yourselves. Encourage you to come to the web, talk to these service providers. They're powering a lot of their hosted offerings using Morpheus. If you're a service provider yourself, please reach out. We'd love to help you develop that side of your business, and make sure that we're working closely with your local vendor of choice if you've got these underpinning infrastructures that you're trying to cloud enable. So going to bring us home. That really is the extended data. We took a bit more time than I thought. It was a great discussion. I promised to keep it short, and I broke my promise. I apologize, but I think that's because it was a rich set of data to unpack, and we actually had a really good discussion. So appreciate everybody keeping on. I didn't see anybody drop, so that's actually a good sign. We must have been entertaining, if nothing else, William. I've got
well, it was only me that dropped.
Nice. It's a good one. We recovered well. It was resiliency, put to bear. A couple of options for folks if they do want to get some more information. Certainly, the best way to learn a little bit more about Morpheus is to jump on a call with one of our SEs, get a demo, let us understand a bit more about some of your specific challenges and see if there's a fit. No pressure, but the product does show better than it tells, and we'd love to give you a quick tour and then see where we go from there. A lot of content on the web you can consume, including a lot of good reports from William and his peers at 451. We've got some other webinars coming up here over the next handful of weeks, so please go to our event page. You can get some of those technical details. And then lastly, we do have a community edition of the platform. It's been provisioned and deployed a couple thousand times over the last year, and so a good way to get your hands dirty or share that link with some of your engineers if somebody wants to have a play. With that, I'll kind of bring us to a close. But William, any final thoughts to share with the team?
No, only that I think there's an exciting new wave of sort of innovation. The cloud management market is one that keeps giving. We've been through a number of waves of consolidation and then new investment cycles, really to support all these new things that that folks want to do. So it's a market of considerable interest over here, and I look forward to seeing how this control plane thing can build out to become more of a full function asset.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks everybody for jumping on the webinar, and hope you have a good rest of your day.